Alrighty guys, we'll get started, Morning everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Simple Starts for Complex Solutions, and is it public space, if you don't know where it is, with Logan Ashmore from Vision Consulting Engineers and Rachael Pull from Far North District Council. I'm Ted Taylor from Eagle, and I'm back again as your host for today, and I'm joined by Greg Price from Eagle and Anya Duxfield from the New Zealand Esri Users Group online today. So thanks for joining us again for the 5th session of our user presentations as we continue on with the virtual user conference series from that webinar we had earlier this week. So before we dive into the presentations, I'll just go over the basics once more so you know how to participate and get the most out of today's event. So as an audience member, you'll be muted during the webinar today, but you will be able to ask questions by typing into the discussion panel as shown here. You can send these questions in at any time during the presentations, we'll address them during the Q&A session at the end. We'll try to answer as many as we can within the time, but if we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll pass these on to the presenters at the end of the webinar. And if you think of any questions after the webinar, you can contact us at gistraining@eagle.co.nz, or feel free to get in touch with the presenters directly. So today's webinar is scheduled to run for an hour. The webinar will be recorded, so don't worry if you have to jump off at any point. And afterwards, you'll receive a follow-up email with the link to access the recording along with others from the series. All right, I'll now hand over to Logan Ashmore from Vision Consulting Engineers to start us off. Good morning, Logan.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the first part of the reserve audit presentation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking because I want to get through Rachael Pull, who I think's got more meat for the discussion today. But instead of doing what I've done in prior years and talking about methodology, I thought it would be more interesting just to take a step back and talk about the process of managing large projects like the reserve audit. And to introduce myself, I've worked for Vision Consulting Engineers up in Kirikiri. My background's in demography and urban planning. And though I work across quite a few applications from day to day, I primarily do work in the Esri space. And to introduce you to the background of the reserve audit, it was actually quite a large project for us. There are 3 primary deliverables with a lot of subcomponents. Throughout the process, we shared 2 drafts for feedback. There were multiple breaks in my workflow, having to address other projects or a couple weeks off to go make another submission for another client. But also it ran over a 6-month period, so plenty of time for me to forget what I had done along the way. And to get into that, it's looking back at the lessons that I'd learned from prior projects. So a big one is changing perspective on the tools that are built into Esri and how to use those tools more effectively to manage that work stream over a long period of time. And part of that is better managing geoprocessing or your model builder or ArcGIS or whatever your chosen analytic tools are. And being smart with the data, not just bashing my way through trying to get to the end product and deliver whatever the end product is, but being more smart about capturing the processes and using more refined steps to getting to the end, but also changing my perspective on some of the more end user focused tools like story maps and ArcGIS online to create effective client engagement throughout the project. So to start it off with, we're all pretty familiar with the analyst pane, and you're accessing your processing history or model builder or Python, whatever you choose to use. And for the longest time, I sort of looked at these as just analyst tools, and then it kind of dawned on me that I was like, actually, this is how I should be managing my project. This is what I should be looking at to record everything that I'm doing, create something that's replicable and shareable, or if I need to go back and do something for a client again in the future, that I've already got it all my process all saved and in place. And really, it's just taking that perspective in and not just treating them as analyst tools. So if you've got a large project, something that's going to be taking place over a long period of time, but it's not particularly complex, you could probably manage everything you need to do through just the geoprocessing history. If it's got some moderate complexities, you're using mostly Arc kind of built-in tools, model builder is great. If you're starting to pull in external libraries or more advanced like machine learning tools, you might need to move over to Python. Regardless of where your project goes, working with your geoprocessing history is a really great place to start, and it communicates really well with Model Builder and Python whenever you want to transition over. Personally, I think you should make that decision a bit early on, because while you can export from Model Builder to Python and do some communication back and forth, it's got a history of lapses in communication, particularly whenever the projects get more complicated. And it was out of pro for a while, and it was back in by popular demand. So I would say just pick the one that you want to work with and you're most comfortable with, and stick with that path. And if you're looking at it from just a simple linear project and you're not doing a lot of relational calculations, or there's not a lot of different paths you're following to get to the end product, I mean, just keeping your geoprocessing clean and managing it well is all you have to do. It's the run, rinse, repeat. You run your tool, you go to your history, you didn't like the results, you run it again, and you just keep repeating that until you get to the stage that you want with that tool, but don't leave it there. Go back to your geoprocessing history, find all those iterations that you don't want to keep and delete them. And then what you have is a very clear record of what you've done. And if you need to share that with another client or for another project, you include that in your history. Someone can look at it and they know what you've done, and they can see the steps that you've taken to get to the end product, and it becomes a lot easier to replicate or implement later. But if you do need to go forward and you need to do more than just kind of keep a clean record of your process over the course of the project, I say Model Builder is a really great place to start, and I would argue that for the analytic tools, it's probably the most accessible to most users. It's got a great visual interface that's easy to learn how to use. It's easy to make the connections, and it's also nice that you can just clean up your initial processing and export it directly to Model Builder, and then you can start refining the process that you want to build from there. That said, I don't really use Model Builder too much anymore, but that's mostly because I've started depending on some external libraries for analytic tools that I use with ArcPy. But again, with ArcPy, it's the same thing. You can use it as a great starting, the geoprocessing history is a great starting place. Do some of your initial runs and then export that to ArcPy and start integrating those other tools that you want to use with it. In both cases with ArcPy and Model Builder, though, I would be sure that if you go that route, you're keeping notes inside of the model, or you're keeping annotations inside of your script. You're putting plenty of reminders in there of where you've gotten and why you've chosen the tools that you have chosen and the steps that you've taken. Just again, because this is about being able to come back later and keep a clean record of what you've done so that you can replicate or share the process. When it gets to the actual analytic part of doing these type of projects, one of the first things that might seem a bit counterintuitive that I'll throw out there is don't manually edit. And I say that because you're trying to keep a record of and if you do it with the tool, if you do your editing with field calculators, that's going to be captured in your geoprocessing history. But I've also had some mixed experiences doing manual editing where I might enter a value into a table, I click on the next cell, it doesn't necessarily save or the table gets hung up. The geoprocessing tools tend to be quite stable and quite reliable, so you're not going to have to worry about that. But that said, you will always run into occasions where you're going to have to make manual changes. Keep a record. As soon as you make that manual change, go into your script or your model or wherever you've chosen to record your process and put that note in there, because I can pretty much guarantee after a couple weeks or a month, if you come back, you're not going to remember exactly what you've done or why you've done it. Whenever you get into doing the actual calculations and working with the fields, this project in particular worked with a lot of text-based fields. The first thing I'll do before even really looking at most of them is I just lowercase everything. And the reason I do that is because when I start getting into the selections and doing maybe some of the SQL queries, I'm going to be sure that I'm not getting silly omission errors just because one word was capitalized in one field and not in the other. But also in the long run, you're going to remove a lot of redundant scripts. So there can be so many permutations of capitalization for the same basic feature that you might be entering the same code 3 or 4 times just because you didn't lowercase. And then it's also going to save you the heartache of having to go back and back check and make sure that you created a query for all those permutations. And if you want to change the casing back later, you can always just run, a proper calculation or something to return it back to the casing that you prefer. And in terms of the first stages of analysis, the first thing that I'll do with almost any project is create summary tables. I'll go to the fields that I'm interested in. I'll run the summary table tool, and I'll get a really quick idea of what the distributions of the values are, what the counts and prevalence of those values are. I might go in and say, okay, well, I'm only interested in the statutory language for roads. I'll do a selection of just the roads and pull out a summary of their statutory language. And you don't necessarily have to use summary tables. There are other summary tools that don't create objects inside of your database. I tend to use them because I want that object there that I can start later querying to maybe produce lists for selections or do other forms of analysis. But it's really down to personal preference and how you're going to use it later. And getting to that stage, after you've sort of done your initial scoping and you want to start doing your analysis, and you know you've got this long process laid out in front of you, make helper columns. You don't have to try and create these long, complex formulas to calculate an end product just with one field. You can create 2 or 3 or 4, however many fields you want, to create different stepping stones to get to that end calculation. I mean, though I wouldn't recommend using them all, your table can, I think, support up to 255 fields. So utilize that space as best you can. And what you don't need for the final project, just delete it at the end before handover. And within those helper columns, I find Boolean variables to be very helpful. They really are good for streamlining your queries and aiding those future classifications. They're easy to build, simple formulas to work with. And even if you don't know what a Boolean variable is, you are familiar with them. Like the easiest example would be like the soil classifications of 1 to 8. It's just an integer that represents a whole lot of different characteristics of a feature to create one final classification. And to give you an example of what it looked like in our project for the reserve audit, we had over 50 different text fields that were used across the 3 different primary work streams. And underneath that, we identified different criteria or classifications of 18 Boolean variables. And so when we go in and say, any text field that shows that this parcel has an indication of recreational use or of conservational use or road use or any of the characteristics we needed to know, we made a very simple field for it with a Boolean variable of yes, no, and then we use yes, no, or 1, 2, 3 or other classifications, and we use that to build the formulas for the final classification. And to visualize why that was so important, for instance, just pick a random, for whatever reason, classification you need to know. Any parcel that has a road or Maori use and also has been designated to have some sort of conservation or reserve use. With the Boolean variables we've created, you can see in that first formula, we have 4 fields. It's just simply equals 1. That would mean a yes for those fields. And then you get a selection of all of those parcels that are meeting the criteria. I then, just for fun, went and looked at, okay, well, if I had to do that as a complete SQL query using all the criteria that created those Boolean variables, what would it look like? And it ended up being this long 2-paragraph query that very likely won't run because I've made a mistake somewhere along the way. So really just encouraging you to see that there's a lot more versatility to creating these helper columns and simplifying the steps where you can. And then moving on from that, once you've gone through your process and you've got some classifications that you think are good to share them with your client. And in that stage of things, why run straight to a meeting when you can create a nice story map for them to interact with? So if you give the client a story map, they're going to get a better feel for the end product, where it's going, what it's going to look like, a lot of time to review. And they themselves will also be able to go around their office or to other people to work with, be like, hey, what do you think? Get their feedback. It gives them plenty of time to digest, and then you can have your meeting and you'll have a lot more productive dialogue coming out of that. And these don't have to be very flash. I'd make them as simple and straightforward as possible. Just show simple features, simple labels. This is what we've done. But if you are going to spend your energy, I would recommend putting it into the pop-ups. I can guarantee one of the first things any user will do is zoom in on the map, and it will probably be their house or their neighborhood, and they're going to click on that map and see what it says about where they live. And the meat of that information is going to come through in the pop-ups. I'm going to encourage you to go in there and learn a bit of Arcade, or maybe play with the HTML layout. And from there, you'll be able to create these really nice streamlined sort of presentations of the data that will clearly show them what you're trying to tell them, or create these dynamic outputs that will give you different paragraphs or different colors of highlight so that you can point them to the specific information that you want to give them about that, that unique feature. And before I hand over, I just really want to make the point that you should get inspired, because there's a lot of different options. Esri has a huge suite of tools, and you can really customize it to work with your workflow in any way you need it to for any project, I would say. And from that, the developers have a very active blog that can give you a lot of ideas. They provide you with a lot of learning tools. But also, one of the best ways to learn is to go in and just press the buttons, see if you can break it. If you do break it, or you come up with a great idea about how not to break it, go to the community forum, and you'll find that developers in the community are quite active at giving feedback and helping you learn these tools. So it's a pretty quick overview, and I think I'm ready to hand it over to Rachel. So I guess we can go ahead and transfer to her and hear how she's using this product.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Logan. Just a reminder for you guys out there as well, if you have any questions along the way, just send those through in the discussion panel on the side, and we'll address those at the end. So yeah, I'll hand over to Rachael Pull from Far North District Council now. Morning, Rachael.
Good morning. Hope you're all doing well.
Yeah.
Here we go. Working? Yes. Awesome.
That looks good.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me today. I'll be upfront, not a GIS expert, so all the technical questions, please just send them all to Logan, because he's done a fantastic job. So my part of the presentation will be focused on the why and the wow. Why GIS work was needed, and wow, look at the outcomes. So the order of my presentation will focus on a bit of an introduction of myself in the Far North and what we were trying to achieve, why we decided to use a GIS platform, what we found, and what the future applications are. So who am I? I'm a total planning nerd, predominantly working in the Resource Management Act and Local Government Acts area, which means I look at a lot of maps, but I don't have a whole heap of experience behind the scenes in terms of putting them all together. I am a complete and utter millennial in that I spend a lot of time with kids, I spend a lot of time walking and cycling, and I very much use technology to find my answers. Big fan of satellite navigation and also Pokemon Go. Why isn't that working? There we go. So, who is the Far North? Well, it's a district that looks a bit like an upside down wine glass. It's very large, it has a lot of coastline, but not a lot of population. And a lot of that population is either under 14 or over 65, which are often two of the groups that we often target when doing open space assessments. Our median income is lower than average, but what you can see in this deprivation index map is that we've got pockets of society that actually have a lot of income and assets, and they're the light coloured ones. And then we've also got some pockets that are very dark coloured, which means they're significantly below that median income. The ones that are below the local parks and reserves are important because that's the only things that they can access. The ones that are really light, they purposely choose a lot of our parks and reserves as the reasons why they go there. That and the ocean, but for the purpose of this talk, we are excluding the ocean. So there's a lot of different terms used to describe your local park or neighbourhood reserve. And these terms were scattered throughout council records. So the first thing I did was actually clarify what it is we're talking about. And I've come up with this diagram. So a reserve can be either for recreation, historic, scenic, scientific, government, or local purpose. And that is a legally protected piece of land that must be used for that assigned purpose. A park is basically any bit of open space that isn't a reserve, and it has a lot less legal protection. In fact, the only legal protection I've found is in the Local Government Act, where it says we must consult before we sell it. But when we're actually looking at open space, we also need to look at the public space as a whole, because I have found reserves that are completely cut off from any sort of public access or public space at all. And without that road or walking track or such, what's the point of having a reserve in the middle of nowhere? So when we're looking at open space, we have to look at the public space as well. So when I took on the job, this is what I came into: an out-of-date, unverified reserve layer on our internal maps. I was told we had 500 hectares of reserve land, but we didn't really have access to that database. There was no public information. If you wanted to know if it was a council park and reserve, you had to go try and find the sign on the site. And if I wanted to know a piece of information for my job, I was actually advised to check out the walking access maps or the dock maps, which are both excellent maps, but don't really give what I needed for my job. So I asked around and asked, what is it that people think about parks and reserves in the far north? And what we heard was, there aren't enough reserves. That Kerikeri gets everything. Does the bylaw apply here? Was a very common question that we got. Are we responsible for maintaining that? And we can't afford to do that project. So what we needed was the equivalent of an amazing Swiss Army knife to answer those questions and also to achieve the things that you're seeing online, on the page here, to comply with our legislation requirements, to actually have the budget to do the job properly, to actually have what we needed in place so that when growth happened, the ratepayer wasn't picking up the bill for the new assets. And then also communicating that with the public and our treaty partners. Visually, the work program ended like this: a cascade of work, all stemming from one source of truth, which was the reserve audit, a GIS database. But when I wrote this, I said reserve because I didn't understand what we meant was open space. So please forgive that error on the slide. But each bit of work shown on this diagram requires specific information on what is out there, what is needed, and what it should be used for. And that can only come from this audit process. So why GIS? Predominantly translation. Our two main customer groups, apart from other internal council departments, are elected members who have to read hundreds of documents a month, or the individual customer who normally has a varying skill level, limited time, and only wants the answer to one question. Efficient data management speaks for itself. You guys know that better than anyone. And fact checking. Logan talked earlier about sending story maps to us as a client. Being able to check those maps and see the errors visually was so much easier than checking 100 lines of Excel data. And yeah, we communicated that with some of our customers and internally, and it was just so much easier. And this is what we got. We got everything. The best part of this database is that we've not limited ourselves to council reserve, which is what our initial paperwork was saying. We've looked at the whole picture. We've looked at dock land, land used for private recreation like golf courses, unformed road, treaty settlement land. Now, this has been very deliberate on my part. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, I'm a high open space user, and I know what the public looks at when they look at open space. They do not look at ownership. They treat the whole site and the journey as one space. Therefore, if we're going to meet our community's well-beings as legally required, we need to be aware of the whole network they live in, not just what we own. So as a comparison, this is the full open space network. In light green, this is the dock network. And this is the council network in blue. As you can see, it really does not show the whole picture. So this is the example I want to use to really push that message home. This is a 1K journey from where I live to where we were going to be doing the presentation, shown in blue. The areas shown in green are the council pieces of land. But as you can see, if we only had that information, that wasn't going to explain anything about how people use this network. This is the same map, but only the legal reserves highlighted, yellow for recreation and pink for local purpose. This is the third map, which shows all open space land. It's showing a bit more. It's showing the school highlighted in pink, some other government purpose showing in red, and then we've got the open space showing in green. But as you'll see, there's two circles on there. That's still not showing the whole network. Those are unformed legal road. It's only when you're showing the whole network that you can actually see why people would take this route. This is actually a very common walking route, both with high school students, also with people with young children, and elderly as well, because the alternative is to actually walk along quite a busy road. But this is why we needed the GIS network, to see the full picture and why the community uses the space the way that they do. We are now officially in the wow part of the presentation. What we found was that a huge amount of district was set aside for open space, 27%. So one of our first comments we received was there wasn't enough reserve. Reserve being a slang for open space, there's actually quite a bit. I think the next question is, do we have enough of the right kind of reserve? An exceptionally small amount of this space was actually in council ownership. So that really made a point in terms of, okay, is council really the people who need to be talking to in terms of making sure we have this open space and that it is open to the public? However, although it was only 0.2%, that was 3 times as much as what we thought we owned, which really explained why our budget was as tight as it was. And that also, there was actually quite a bit of land that we still needed to clarify ownership, which explains why some of our customers were getting frustrated because they didn't know who owned the land. And when they had an idea for improvement, they had no idea who to talk to. So when we looked at the maps in detail, we also found some very interesting things. One of the main things we found, a lot of our assets were not on our land, or at least our open space land. A lot of it was actually on dock reserve or road reserve. Another problem we found a lot, and you can see a little bit of it on this map, is that assets we didn't know about were being built on our land. You can see some wharfs and jetties there. We saw a lot of bridges and tracks being formed. And the problem with that is council becomes liable. So that was one of the issues behind Cave Creek, And so that makes our staff really nervous. And what you do see circled here is encroachments. Is the question, do we have enough land? Or is the question, how do we let people know that that land is there? There are some people, some of them are accidental, some of them are on purpose, that have just extended their gardens just a little further and their fences, and occasionally cut down our signs and pretended the land is theirs. So perhaps we have a bit more land than we thought we did. Another thing that the GIS network has been great at showing us is things like this blue-green network in Kaitaia. The council reserves are in blue here. The rest of the open space network is just highlighted. What it shows that although if you just look at the numbers, we have more than enough reserve for our Kaitaia population, it does follow the river and its main diversion. And when we add the flooding, we do not have a lot of reserve land. Add climate change on top of that, and what does it mean for our open space network moving into the future? Do we need to look at moving stuff away? Do we need to look at making it more resilient or changing its purpose? The information on this GIS map will be used to help develop our response to climate change, where we take new reserves, what size and purpose they'll be, and how they're viewed in terms of the wider network. So, what next? The number one goal for us is communication. One of the main bits of feedback was that there wasn't enough open space. Now that we know 27% of the district is open space, we need to look at what the real problem is. The same for bylaw implementation. Bylaws only apply on council-owned land, which we saw was only 0.2% of the district and only a very small portion of that open space. Our bylaws even take it a step further because they have legally separated parks and reserves and put different rules for each of them. But our enforcement team and the public don't always know the difference. Dogs can be off-leash on parks, but must be on-leash for reserves and road. Throw in some naming, and that gets even worse. Our main sporting complex, which is a legal recreation reserve, is called Linvat Park. So, dogs on or off? One of our most famous walkways, the Paihia to Opua walkway, most of that is actually legally road. So, in terms of what next, reclassifying the reserves that are not used for purpose, correcting data, and actually communicating with the public what those pieces of land are legally for is our short-term goal. Medium term, this information can help with this treaty settlement process. Iwi need to know what land are available and how close it is to their land before they can actually work out whether or not it'll help provide restitution for what was taken off them. And where the land is in council ownership as opposed to Crown and therefore not eligible to be returned, we can look at other options such as joint management. This will help with the open space strategy and the policy in terms of setting what acceptable levels are per heads of population. This will help in terms of a procedure manual and making sure how we treat each reserve is consistent with its legal purpose. Reserves contributions. If we can prove using the reserve audit that there is a lack of open space opportunities in this area, we can then get developers who develop in that area to actually provide that land, which means then the ratepayers aren't. And in our long-term plan, getting that correct maintenance budget in there so that we're not short of money when we need to do up toilets or everything else. Long-term, as I mentioned before, climate change strategy. We have a legal requirement to do a reserve management plan for every legal piece of reserve that we own or administer. Finally, we now know how much land we own and administer. We do have some plans, but we're not fully compliant, and we need to be compliant by March of 1983. So there's a bit of work to do there. Resource allocation will be a whole lot fairer, and we'll hopefully have the budget for. Less paperwork in the long term because everything will be documented and therefore won't have to be justified. Better Pokemon adventures is important because if people know where the land is, they'll go there, and our open space areas are often where both Pokemon, the Wizards, and other future apps often have as main gathering points. My Adventure app is an excellent thing put forward by the Walking Commission, who actually want to document where all our great walks and recreation opportunities are in the country. It's a free thing for council. We just need to give them the information and then we'll get a huge tourist boost. Encroachment enforcement, which I talked about. A park search by facility. That is a big dream of mine, and this audit is really going to help with that. Auckland has it, and I strongly advise you check it out, where you can go, oh, I want to take the kids to a park this weekend. Well, obviously not this weekend, but when you get to level 2 or level 1, you can go say, we want to make a day of it. We'll need somewhere with a toilet. We'll need somewhere that there's a playground. We need somewhere with beach access. You can put those options in there and it'll give you a list of parks in your area. Encroachment enforcement, as I mentioned, a consistent approach to that, and actually making sure our parks and reserves are able to be accessed by the public would be brilliant. Healthier communities, admittedly, this is an assumption. The idea is that people know where these parks are, then they will come. If we're building the facilities, they will use them. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee that they will not stop at McDonald's on the way home, but I'm still putting it up there as a long-term outcome of this audit. And in the future, including the covenant and easement information once we work out which ones of those are public access, because we don't want to put them all up and have the public think that they're all accessible. Even at this really early stage, we've had a whole range of benefits. We put a minimum viable product online, just a really basic map out for the public, and we've gotten great feedback. And because of that feedback, we're actually getting ready to put out the second version. It should be up soon and even more user-friendly than the first. We've identified lands that didn't belong to us, that we had registered as us, so it's very good to sort those out. We've found more reserves to manage and stop managing. There's been several people who thought we owned land that we didn't and were therefore responsible for the issues on them. We're actually able to make better reserve decisions because we are looking at the big picture. It's not about looking at one reserve in particular, it's about looking at the whole network. Our infrastructure team, as I mentioned, have found more assets. I consider that a benefit. For the person having to now load them and record them in our system, he might not agree with me just yet. We are getting less queries because the public are using the map, and we are improving our customer relationship head over heels. And all of this is possible because of the reserve audit. If you want to check it out for yourself, that minimum viable product is available on the Far North District Council webpage under Have Your Say. There's even a small questionnaire and a discussion thing if you want to put in your 2 cents. And if you want to see how much further we can go, like I said, the Auckland Council webpage or the Find My Adventure webpage is just here. And like I said, They're absolutely brilliant, and I fully recommend you check them out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to hearing any non-technical questions.
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. There was a very thorough presentation, I must say. I really enjoyed it. Okay, guys, we'll now move across to the Q&A part of today's presentation. So if I can call on my colleague, Greg Price, to kick us off with any questions we have. Greg, are you there?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Ted. Great presentation, Logan. I really enjoyed that. And there are some awesome tips and recommendations, technical tips and recommendations there, which I think a lot of the people listening will get some things out of that. So my question to you is, do you have any other troubleshooting tips or resources or approach that you haven't talked about yet that maybe you can share with the listeners?
It might sound funny, but getting really good at Googling, like when I was in university, we actually had entire lessons on how to make a good query in Google or in Stacks to find the specific answers you want. So I don't have any resources immediately available, but it's surprising how forming your question in the search engine will greatly define the quality of the information that you'll be able to get back out.
That's some awesome advice. Where can people, do you know of you did through Open University, is there a place that people can do to get some advice on how to craft better Google searches?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that like I don't have any immediate resources off the top of my head, but I could try and delve back into my memory and find out like the resources that we used at the time, and maybe try and put those up there. But I mean, there's a high probability that within the Esri community that information's already out there. So probably a good place to start is looking at forum rules, like, or Stack Exchange, or rules, like they'll tell you this is what a good question is. Moderators might come in and actually say, can you give us more information, and point you to those rules. So a lot of times forums will tell you what will make a good question. So do pay attention to those.
Awesome, that's some great advice. Thanks, Logan.
That's a good one, isn't it?
Now,
using Google to figure out. Yeah, I was just going to say that's a good one. Using Google to figure out how to use Google better. It's like an endless loop. Here's another one for you, Logan. How did you source the variety of data sets that you thought were required for completing this project or completing your projects?
I would say part of it was the experience that I've had. I actually used to work at Far North District Council doing an analysis work for them, so I was pretty familiar with what council already had internally. So that was a bit of a benefit, a bit of a leg up, but it's also going out there and first doing the foundational research of what sort of layers are out there, what has the Walking Access Commission, what have they used, what's on DOC's websites, and just getting a feel for their layers, what they've done, any methodologies they've recommended, make sure that I'm not kind of walking this an already beaten path and replicating work. So it's first getting out there, kind of getting that impression or the audit of what information is already available, what methods have already been used, and then kind of using your own knowledge of the data sets you have experience with to build on that. It gets to one of the first things that we put together during the proposal phase was, here's the list of information that could help in identifying reserves in open space, and put that back to Far North District Council or any client and say, do you have any information on this? Give us basically any data that you think might fall into this criteria, and then let us kind of sort out its significance.
Great. I think someone, Quinton, might have actually just put in a resource there into the questions area, so we can make that available to everyone as well, somewhere people can go look for how to Google better. So that's great. Do you have any other questions for Logan, Ted?
I've got another question for Logan, but I think I'll move across to Rachel now and ask her a question. We've just had another one come through from Anya, who's online. Can you ask? Oh, here we go. Rachel, do you feel that community engagement is essential to a process or project like the reserves audit?
On the whole, yes. The audit is useful in terms of, you know, just the legal requirements and pulling that all together. But the true value is understanding how the community actually relates to the pieces of land, their value, and you know, their wider network plans. So community engagement is essential, even at the audit stage, and that's why I actually tested the product as Logan was developing it on members of the community. Because, you know, if it's not going to work for our end users, what's the point of doing it?
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. I'll ask you another one on as well, Rachel. Well, while you're chatting, I imagine there'll be a big uptake of people going out and using these reserves once the lockdown levels sort of ease a little bit. You mentioned for a moment there that you were having some issues with signage and people like cutting down signs. Is that something that's quite widespread, or does that happen a lot?
To be honest, it mostly happens with dog owners who do not agree with the bylaw requirements. But yeah, that particular example I was talking about, when an access to a reserve is next to a person's property, sometimes they feel that people shouldn't be accessing the land there, and so they try to make it look as much like their land as possible.
And I imagine there'll be a bit of signage that needs to go up as a result of this, around like clarifying whether, you know, if it's a park or if it's a reserve, and if there's in a specific specific access requirements. Is that something that you guys will be addressing as well?
Yes, yeah. So we already started seeing it prior to the lockdown, is that, oh my goodness, this is council land. You need to get a sign up on that, you know, because people are now actually understanding that. They're letting us know where the signage is missing, and so we can actually get that out there. But yeah, it does mean we need to make some adjustments to our budget.
Yeah. I think those apps will be a great help as well to really get the public engagement, and then they can provide you with that feedback too.
Yeah, we've got so many opportunities and things we can do now that we've got much better information in a platform that we can adapt to so many different projects.
Okay, Greg, do you have any questions for Logan and Rachel?
Yeah, I've got another one here for you, Rachel. So firstly, I think it's a great idea to look at open space as a open space network, which is, you know, across all the different agencies. So first question is, the two main ones were, of course, council and DOC. Was there any other land owners that could come into that mix as well?
The next two big ones are treaty settlement legislation. So, for example, 90 Mile Beach is now no longer in Crown ownership. It's run by a board which is made up of iwi representatives and Crown representatives, including ourselves. So getting that board on board. And then there's also Heritage New Zealand has a few sites. But then you can also look at private landowners, like I said, like private golf courses. So it's just how big you want to get in there. But another one I want to get in is Ministry of Education. You don't think about it, but walking across school land, playing a bit of sport on school land. It's actually really common.
It is. That's awesome. Do you have any idea of how much? I guess you mentioned earlier in the presentation that some council land was kind of cut off, or open spaces was cut off. How much of that may now start to be able to be opened up and now usable by taking this approach and identifying them?
Yep. So there's a really excellent example of a very historic piece of land that's actually owned by Heritage New Zealand, and it is completely cut off. But what we found is that there is an unformed legal road going from the existing road and past this piece of land. So if we can actually legally stop that road, it'll default to Esplanade Reserve, and then people could actually walk to this reserve, which is by a beautiful beach, and it's absolutely beautiful. The only holdup is, of course, the neighbours have encroached and taken all that land again, and expanded their garden and put in their own boat jetties and such. So there are a lot of opportunities now that we can see this information to actually correct some of that stuff and improve tourism.
It's fantastic. I've got a question here from Sahar. They would like to ask what asset management software FNDC is using.
We're actually in the project of upgrading it to something called Project Darwin. Up until now, it's not been too great, and it's mostly just been stored on one of our internal GIS layers. Logan can probably describe it better than me.
So in terms of storage at Far North District Council, property information falls across several geodatabases that are held on the server, but there's also a lot of information held inside of a SQL server as well. So it just depends on what specific type of information you're trying to pull out about the piece of land.
Okay, thanks. Right, do you have any more questions for Rachel or Logan, Ted?
Yep, I've just a few more for me. Here's another one for you, Rachel. You mentioned these encroachments from individuals and say property owners. Obviously, there's only so much you can do, but how do you try and stop them from like pushing back, I guess, and like just I suppose like working with them to try and work towards a common goal?
Yep. So we've been working on a plan for that since it is a lot more widespread than what we thought. And our initial plan is to identify these sites via aerial photography and just send them a letter in batches going, look, our maps have indicated there's a slight issue. We'd love to make a time to come chat to you about it, and just try and actually resolve it friendly-like as much as possible. Not penalise them for occupying reserve land in the past, but just trying to resolve it for the future. The other thing we're doing is when we get applications for new activities adjoining reserve land, we're putting on comments asking that the boundary be very clearly defined through a solid fence or other means that visually shows that this is exactly where the boundary is, to try and then prevent that encroachment in the future accidentally. So if anything happens, it's happened because the neighbour is not playing nice.
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent strategy to work with them and get them on side. Logan, here's one final one for you. Are there any tools or I suppose or platforms or such that you're looking to learn or become familiar with moving forward?
I guess it's been interesting for me because my background actually started more with like SAS or R, like statistical software. And then I also had some learning in GIS. And in reality, I don't I don't think I'm interested in learning new platforms. It's more about trying to better integrate the two different disciplines. So that's one of the reasons that I've basically transitioned to mostly working in ArcGIS, is because there's so many tools that are built out with, and I also have done some work with the RBridge as well, but both for R and Python, the libraries are there. It's just getting comfortable with communicating between either QGIS or ArcGIS and these outside libraries, I think is, you know, a lifetime of learning already ahead of me.
Yeah. There's and I know personally that ArcPy catalog is pretty comprehensive, and there's always things being added in there.
I just have one final question for Rachel. Do you know what you're doing here is pretty awesome. Do you know of any other councils that are taking a similar type of approach?
A lot of councils have gone that way of putting their open space on. I just I don't know how many have actually gone as wide as we have. That was more me pushing it than anyone else, because like I said, I know how people look at open space. But yeah, I'm totally blown away with the work Auckland's done. I think their website is brilliant. A lot of councils have that information, but spread over several maps in the public sphere. So yeah, I'd hope long term that we'd have it all combined in one map available for the public on our system.
Fantastic. Looking forward to seeing that myself.
We've got one final question here. I think you've already touched on this already, but probably elaborate a little more. So there's many open spaces like the schools, golf courses, sports grounds, and such. Many of those would discourage casual use. I suppose to try and encourage them to to allow the public on there. That could be something you guys are looking into.
So yeah, we have shared user agreements with a lot of our skills. On the public map, I've deliberately left off iwi-owned reserves, but yeah, we could definitely have those chats. And with the next version we want to put out, we actually want to say who the owner is, so that they can contact that direct group and if they want to use that piece of land. So then hopefully that's less queries for us, less frustration for the customer, and yeah, we can slowly build those relationships up and get those agreements in place, like you said.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, we've just ticked over 12, so I think we'll call the Q&A there. Thanks for all the audience that sent through those questions, and thanks Greg for helping me out there. We'll call it there. If you have any more questions that you want to send through, you can submit them to GIS training at eagle.co.nz, or feel free to get in touch with the directors directly. Our next presentation will take place next week on Tuesday, 20th of April at 11 AM. So please visit the Eagle website here and register if you haven't already done so. And again, here's that link to access today's recording at in a few hours, and also the other recordings from earlier in the series. So big thanks to Logan and Rachel for presenting today. Thanks for taking your time and showing off your amazing skills and solutions and projects you're working on. So just a reminder for everyone, these VUCs are a collaboration between the user group and the partners, GBS, Eagle Technology, and Alterra. And the user group would also like to say a massive thanks to the RUC/VUC sponsors for 2020, National Map, GeoWorks, Jacob, and First Name. So thanks everyone for your time today. Have a fantastic long weekend and Anzac Day, and we look forward to seeing you online next week for our 6th webinar and seeing you face to face as soon as possible. Thanks very much, everyone.